Settle in, I'm Alex, and this is The Last Climb. In today's video, we're covering how 2026 will be remembered as Everest's tragic downfall. From overcrowding, dumb influencers, costs through the roof, to more deaths and trash than the mountain has ever seen. It was May 3rd, 2026. The south col of Mount Everest sits at 26,300 feet. A wind-scoured saddle of ice and broken rock caught between the upper faces of Everest and Lhasa. Temperatures that week had been swinging between minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight and just above 0 degrees Fahrenheit during the narrow midday window. Yemi Mensah was 36 years old, a community health worker from Raleigh, North Carolina. She spent her days helping people navigate systems that weren't built with them in mind, connecting families to care, filling the gaps that larger institutions either couldn't see or chose not to. She had been saving for this climb for 9 years. Not casually, deliberately, with a timeline and a specific permit season circled years in advance. She had summited peaks above 20,000 feet before. She understood acclimatization, understood altitude physiology in a way most recreational climbers don't. What she hadn't fully accounted for was how differently risk works when you're on the cheapest permitted expedition on the mountain and your contract has gaps in it that nobody explained to her clearly. The permit fee alone in 2026 was $15,000. The environmental fee added another $4,000 on top of that. By the time Yemi had covered those costs in the base expedition package, there was almost nothing left for anything else. She went with the lowest cost operator available, still permitted, still technically legitimate, but running a stripped-down operation with minimal medical equipment and no dedicated rescue coverage above 27,000 feet. That last part was buried in the contract. I don't know if she ever got that far because a lot of people don't. She moved well through the lower sections of the mountain. Her guide noted she was steady, careful, and did not take unnecessary risks. She made it to Camp 4 at 26,000 feet without any major problems. And on her summit push, she was keeping pace with the group. She was actually remarkable. Nothing pointed out what was about to happen. The symptoms showed up on her descent somewhere above Camp 4 on the southeast ridge. A headache first, the kind that starts behind the eyes and builds until it's the only thing you're aware of. Within an hour, she could barely focus on the rope in front of her. Then came the coordination failures. A stumble on a section of fixed rope she would have handled without thinking on the way up. A slower grip, a delayed response to her guide's directions. Her guide had seen it before. He knew what he was looking at the moment the stumble happened, and he didn't wait to be sure. He radioed down immediately. The standard response in that situation requires equipment, and it requires speed. Her expedition had neither working in her favor. Getting her down was the only path forward, but Yemi couldn't walk. Her guide radioed for rescue at approximately 27,400 feet. The response he got back was a request for payment authorization before a team would mobilize. That was the system in 2026. Rescue coordination required upfront confirmation from the expedition operator before dispatching a team. Her operator couldn't authorize it. The coverage in her contract explicitly excluded rescue operations above 27,000 feet. Her guide kept calling. The logs recovered afterward showed 11 separate distress calls over a 4-hour window. Every one of them went unanswered by rescue coordination. Yemi collapsed fully at 27,400 feet on the southeast ridge, conscious at first, but unable to walk or communicate clearly. Over the next 4 hours, at least 30 climbers passed her on the rope line. 30 people. Every single one of them saw her. Not one of them stopped. At that altitude in a closing weather window, with everyone focused on getting down alive, stopping for someone else is a decision most people won't make. That was the reality of Everest in 2026. Her tracking chip was sending her exact location the entire time. Rescue coordination had her position. No one came. Her condition kept getting worse as the hours passed. The cerebral edema progressing with nothing to slow it down. Her consciousness fading, while her guide stayed by her side. A descending team found her the following morning. Her guide had stayed with her until the darkness and the conditions left him no choice but to move. The radio logs came back. All 11 calls, time-stamped, unanswered. Her tracking chip had transmitted continuously for 5 hours before it went still. The official findings listed high-altitude cerebral edema as the cause of death, with inadequate expedition medical provisions and failed rescue authorization as contributing factors. Her operator's contract was reviewed and found to exclude coverage above 27,000 feet, the exact altitude where she needed it most. The case was ruled accidental. It was April 18, 2026, Mount Everest, Nepal, the southeast ridge, the only road open that season after the Tibet side had shut down completely. One path, one weather window, and more climbers on that mountain than any season in recorded history. What happened up there didn't surprise me. That's the part that bothers me most. Caius Nwosu was 31 years old, a content creator from Atlanta. Not a mountaineer, not even close. The highest he'd ever been was around 19,000 feet. A guided trip he'd done the year before. But he had a following, a camera setup, and a belief that summiting Everest on film would make his career. He came to base camp with 2 phones, and that gimbal. I remember seeing it and thinking, that thing is not going to make it past Camp 2. He left it at base camp after the first acclimatization rotation. Too heavy, too awkward on the fixed lines. Just the phones from that point on. His permit came through a third-party booking site. No background check, no screening, no questions asked. Nepal had announced tough new rules taking effect in 2027. Experience requirements, operator licensing, permit caps. The moment it landed, hundreds of climbers rushed to get on the mountain before any of it could stop them. From the start, Caius was always the last one moving. The reason was never a mystery. He would stop to pull out his phone and spend the next few minutes searching for the perfect angle. The guides told him to keep up. He would, briefly, and then 20 minutes later, he'd be at the back of the line again, doing the same thing. It didn't take me long to figure out what kind of problem he was going to be. Summit night, wind chill was sitting at around minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the fixed lines were packed with climbers from every expedition on the mountain. It was the only weather window of the season, and nobody was going to wait. The mountain had one opening, and hundreds of people trying to squeeze through it at the same time. Like every climber above 26,000 feet that season, Caius was on supplemental oxygen, a flow rate set by his guide before the summit push. It keeps you functional up there, but it is not a buffer against everything. The moment you stop moving at that altitude, your body stops generating heat. And even with oxygen flowing, your core temperature can drop to a dangerous level faster than most people expect. He cleared Camp 4, which was surprising, not gonna lie. By then he had settled somewhere in the middle of the line, carried along with the flow of the crowd. But above 28,000 feet on the southeast ridge, he stopped, pulled off both outer gloves, got out his phone, and stood there filming for nearly 20 minutes while there's a line of climbers backed up behind him in the dark and cold. The teams ahead kept moving, assuming he would catch up. The ones behind him went around, unclipping from the fixed line and clipping back on the other side of him without slowing down. Nobody had a choice. At that height, in those temperatures, your only protection against dying is forward movement. The moment you stop, the mountain starts winning. What nobody realized in that moment was that Caius wasn't just filming anymore, he was already dying. At 28,100 feet, the moment you stop moving, your body stops generating heat and your blood oxygen starts dropping fast. The brain doesn't sound an alarm, it just quietly begins to fail. He wasn't screaming or calling for help. He was just standing there, phone in hand, with no idea what was happening to him, and then his knees gave out and he fell forward into the fixed rope, sliding about 30 feet before the line caught him. The rope and the ice hit his chest and face hard. He was still clipped in and still on the mountain, but there was nothing left in him. A descending Sherpa found him about 4 hours later and immediately called it in. A rescue team pushed up, but the altitude and the crowded route slowed everything down, and it took them over 2 hours to reach him. By the time they got there, it was already too late. He was declared dead on the mountain. A helicopter couldn't reach that elevation, so his body stayed up there for 3 days until a recovery team was able to bring him down. His phone came back with him. The footage was still there. The last clip was time-stamped 3:47 in the morning at 28,100 feet. His tracking chip confirmed the exact spot where he stopped. Just over 20 minutes, not moving, right at the point where he collapsed. The official cause of death was hypoxic cerebral shutdown, made worse by standing still for too long in extreme cold. Both hands had severe frostbite from taking his gloves off. The fall was listed as a contributing injury. The case was ruled accidental. The expedition operator faced no consequences. It was April 22nd, 2026, the Lhotse Face, Mount Everest, Nepal, a near vertical wall of glacial ice rising over 3,600 feet between Camp 2 and Camp 4, one of the most technically demanding sections of the entire Southeast Ridge route. Every climber on that mountain that season passed through it. There is no way around it. Petra Sundvik was 38 years old, an urban planner from Portland, Oregon. She had been to 3 Himalayan summits before Everest. She made a career out of spotting the gap between what looks safe and what actually is, and she brought that instinct into every climb. She had no cameras, no sponsors, no audience watching, just her and the mountain. Everest was the final climb on a personal list she'd been working through for years. I remember thinking she was probably the most prepared person at base camp that season. She made the summit, and she was on her way back down when it happened. The Lhotse Face sits between Camp 3 and Camp 4 on the Southeast Ridge. It's a near vertical wall of blue ice, roughly 4,000 feet of it, and the only way up is to front point your crampons in and move one careful step at a time. You stay clipped to a fixed rope the whole way, with nothing below you for a very long drop. It's one of the hardest sections on the entire route, and also one of the busiest, because there's simply no way around it. Every climber goes up it, and every climber comes back down it. There's no easier way home. By 2026, the waste on that face had reached a genuinely dangerous level. Oxygen canisters, tent frames, rope segments, food packaging, years of it compacted into the ice, building up into shelves and overhangs that weren't there a decade ago. A non-refundable $4,000 environmental fee and a heavy lift drone program had been introduced that season to carry supplies up and remove trash coming down. Neither could keep up with the volume. One section in particular stood out. Around 26,200 feet, just below a natural rock ledge on the traverse line, a debris shelf roughly 8 feet wide had frozen solid into the face directly above the main descent path. Petra had noted it in her GPS logs during her second acclimatization rotation, flagged it again on her third. She mentioned it to her expedition leader both times. It was acknowledged. It was written down. Nothing was done about it. She passed that section clean on her way up. The shelf was still there when she came back down. At around 26,200 feet on her way down, clipped in and moving carefully, a team passing above her brushed the edge of the shelf. That was enough. Everything came loose at once. Oxygen canisters, frozen debris, chunks of ice that had been sitting up there for years. It dropped fast, and she was right in the fall line with no warning and no time to move. That's the thing about this kind of accident. There's no moment where she could have done anything differently. The decision that killed her was made by someone else entirely. The impact hit her from above and behind, straight to the back of her skull and upper spine, and the force threw her off the face. She fell about 40 feet before her safety tether caught the fixed rope and stopped her. 2 climbers got to her within minutes. She was conscious, but had no feeling in her legs. At 26,000 feet on near vertical ice, with the weather getting worse, there was barely anything they could do. Moving someone with a spinal injury on that terrain without the right equipment can make everything worse, so they stayed with her, kept her as still as possible, and called for help immediately. A rescue team started up from lower, on the mountain as fast as they could manage. The nearest team was at Camp 2, roughly 3,500 feet below her position. At that altitude, pushing upward at any real speed costs oxygen and time that nobody up there has to spare. The temperature was around minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, wind at 30 miles per hour. She lost consciousness within roughly 40 minutes of the impact. The rescue team reached her 3 hours after the call went out. She was already gone. Her body was lowered progressively over the following day and recovered from the mountain. The GPS device came back with her, every log entry intact, including both notations about the debris shelf at 26,200 feet, each time stamped weeks before her death. Her tracking chip confirmed her exact position and the precise time she stopped moving. The debris field was photographed and documented by the recovery team. Officially, the findings listed blunt force trauma to the back of the skull and a fracture at the 4th and 5th cervical vertebrae as the primary injuries, with exposure following incapacitation as the final contributing factor. Accidental death. The debris accumulation was noted as a contributing environmental hazard, and the drone removal program was flagged as inadequate for the season's volume. It was April 27th, 2026, the summit of Mount Everest, Nepal, at 29,032 feet. Knowing that number and actually feeling it are two completely different things. At that elevation, your body is running on borrowed time the moment you arrive. Every minute you stay past your turnaround window is a minute your oxygen reserves are drawing down, your core temperature is dropping, and your decision-making is quietly deteriorating in ways you won't even notice. Nev Castillo was 27 years old, ran a wellness page out of Miami, clean living, adventure travel, the kind of content that makes everything look effortless. A brand sponsorship covered most of her expedition costs. That wasn't unusual in 2026. Total expedition costs were running between $45,000 and $100,000 once everything was factored in. Brand deals had become one of the only ways younger climbers could afford to be there at all. She had never been above 14,500 feet before this climb. Her only real altitude experience was a guided trek in Peru the year before. She trained hard and her fitness showed, but physical preparation only gets you so far at 29,000 feet. Neve had no real experience with what a body goes through in the death zone, and nobody had made that clear enough to her. Or maybe someone had tried and it just never landed. Her operator took the booking without flagging any of it. That was 2026. The pre-regulation rush had every operator filling spots as fast as they could, and a well-sponsored client with money behind her was not someone anyone was going to turn away. I saw that pattern repeat itself all season. The money moved faster than the judgment did. From Camp 3, she was visibly working harder than most. Her pace was slower than her Sherpa wanted, and the rest stops were coming too often. She was stopping to shoot content on the way up as well. Not as badly as some that season, but enough that her Sherpa was calling it into base camp. She hit the summit at 10:47 in the morning. Her turnaround had been set for 10 a.m. She was already 47 minutes over it by the time she arrived. Her Sherpa told her clearly that they needed to leave right away, but she didn't move. I don't think she really understood what being 47 minutes past turnaround actually meant up there. That it wasn't just a guideline, her oxygen reserves had already changed, and every extra minute she spent up there was shrinking her window for getting back down safely. She started shooting instead. Photos, video, moving around for different angles. At some point, she took her oxygen mask off for a cleaner shot, and then did it again a few times, 3 to 4 minutes each time without oxygen. At 29,032 feet, that's enough to send your blood oxygen crashing, and at that altitude your body doesn't recover from it quickly even after the mask goes back on. The final descent order came at 11:42 a.m. Neve was still adjusting her position for a shot. At around 11:55, she sat down in the snow. Not intentionally, her legs just gave out. Her Sherpa got her upright and moving. She managed roughly 200 feet of descent before her legs stopped working entirely. At approximately 29,015 feet, she went down and didn't get back up. The remaining emergency oxygen was administered immediately. She didn't respond to it. The wind had picked up to 45 miles per hour. Temperature with wind chill was around minus 52 degrees Fahrenheit. He stayed with her for 90 minutes, doing everything within his means, before base camp ordered him off the mountain. A rescue team had already been dispatched from Camp 4, which sits at 26,000 feet, meaning that team was pushing nearly 3,000 feet upward into the death zone to reach her. But the altitude, the wind, and the distance meant they didn't reach her position until 2 hours and 20 minutes after she collapsed. She was already gone. The body couldn't be safely moved in those conditions and remained on the mountain for 11 days before a recovery window opened. Her camera came back with her, 340 photos and 6 video clips. The last image time-stamped 11:51 a.m., 4 minutes before she collapsed. Her oxygen regulator logs were recovered by her Sherpa and reviewed afterward. Her tracking chip confirmed her summit arrival time, the duration she remained there, and the exact point on the descent where she stopped moving. The official findings listed hypoxic cardiac arrest as the cause of death. Contributing factors were documented as extended time above the turnaround threshold, repeated removal of the supplemental oxygen mask at extreme altitude, and physical exhaustion. The case was ruled accidental. No action was taken against the expedition operator. It was April 30th, 2026, Mount Everest, Nepal. The fixed ropes on the southeast ridge are what keep every climber on that mountain alive. They're installed at the start of each season and then used continuously, relentlessly, by hundreds of climbers for weeks on end. In a normal season, that system holds. This was not a normal season. Jarrell Madsen was 38 years old, a demolition contractor from Denver, Colorado. Unfinished business. That was the only reason he came back. He had turned around at 27,000 feet on his first attempt, when the weather shut everything down. But he wasn't the type to leave things unfinished. Summit Day in 2026 was unlike anything I had seen before. China had closed the Tibet side completely that season, pushing every climber who would have taken the northern route onto the single Nepal line. The pre-regulation rush had filled every permitted expedition to capacity on top of that. The tracking chips every climber was required to carry were transmitting a real-time density map back to base camp. And what that map showed on Summit Day was staggering. Roughly 190 climbers on the southeast ridge within a 6-hour window. One route, one rope system, all of them moving through the same anchor points, clipping and unclipping the same sections of fixed line hour after hour. The fixed ropes on the upper mountain had been in place since early season, and nobody had replaced them. Above 27,000 feet, several anchor points were visibly worn, flagged by early season teams, but never dealt with because the traffic never stopped long enough for anyone to pull climbers off and fix anything. There was simply no gap in the crowds to do it. Jarrell's group waited at the balcony at 27,600 feet for just over 2 hours, standing still and clipped to the same rope sections while the line above slowly moved. That kind of sustained weight on the same anchor points over that amount of time takes a toll. By the time his group pushed past the balcony towards South Summit, those ropes had been under load for hours. At around 28,400 feet, there were 14 climbers clipped to one section of fixed rope all at the same time. Jarrell was among them. The upper anchor failed, a connection point that teams had been flagging for weeks. When it gave way, the rope dropped and took 4 climbers on the lower section down with it. Jarrell fell approximately 150 feet before a secondary fixed rope lower on the rope stopped him. The arrest was violent. The sudden load on the lower anchor snapped him hard against the ice face. He sustained fractures to both legs, multiple rib fractures, and significant head trauma from the impact against the ice during the fall. 2 of the other 3 climbers who fell were never recovered. He survived the fall, briefly conscious, but stranded at roughly 28,250 feet, with both legs fractured and no way to move in that freezing temperatures, with no shelter anywhere on the section of the ridge. Radio contact with base camp went up almost immediately. There were witnesses. Everywhere, this happened in the middle of a packed summit push. But above 28,000 feet, a rescue operation is working at the absolute limit of what's physically possible. The team that went up pushed as hard as they could. It wasn't enough because eventually Jarrell died from his injuries and exposure roughly 3 hours after the fall. His body was brought down 6 days later. The rope section that failed came with him and was examined. The anchor had metal fatigue and fraying that matched what happens when a connection point is pushed far beyond its limit for too long. Tracking data confirmed 14 climbers clipped to the same section at the moment it gave out. The official findings listed blunt polytrauma and internal hemorrhage as the cause of death, with exposure as a contributing factor. The expedition operator was formally cited for not replacing the fixed ropes during the active season. It was May 1st, 2026, Mount Everest, Nepal. The southeast ridge that season had already seen more traffic in a single month than most routes see in a full year. Every camp was crowded, every fixed line was worn, and the weather window everyone had been waiting on was finally opening. Harlan Wolf was 25 years old, a personal trainer from Phoenix, Arizona. Fit, driven, someone who believed hard enough that physical preparation could solve most problems. And to be fair, he had put in the work. Months of training, weighted pack hikes, everything you can do at sea level. But none of that changed the fact that his highest prior altitude was just under 14,000 feet. A weekend trip to Colorado the year before. That was the extent of his experience going into one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. He got his permit through a third-party reseller with no experience audit and no credential check. The reseller was moving allocations fast that season. The rush to beat the 2027 regulations had created a secondary permit market where speed mattered more than screening. Harlan Poe's the permit cleared, and nobody asked if he should actually be there. His operator was raising concerns about his pace and his technical ability from as early as Camp 2. They raised it yes, but nothing really happened. Watching climbers like Harlan that season, what stood out to me wasn't arrogance. It was how genuinely unaware they were. He didn't know what he didn't know. He believed fitness was the main variable, and honestly up to a point it is. But above 26,000 feet, none of that matters the way you think it does. The death zone doesn't negotiate with anyone. He struggled from Camp 2 onward, slower than everyone else, more rest stops than his Sherpa wanted, visibly working harder than the climbers around him just to keep moving. By Camp 3 at around 23,500 feet, his guide had flagged him twice. Nothing changed. On summit day, he was already 40 minutes behind his group before they even pushed above Camp 3. The whiteout hit fast at around 26,800 feet. Visibility dropped to under 10 feet within minutes. The kind of condition where the fixed rope right in front of you vanishes, and the only thing keeping you en route is your grip on the line. When visibility goes like that, you stop moving and you stay on the rope. You don't take a single step without your hand on it. Harlan didn't have that instinct. Nobody had drilled it into him because nobody with the authority to pull him off the mountain had ever taken his inexperience seriously enough. The group ahead sheltered and held position. Radio calls went out and Harlan didn't respond. He wasn't with them. What the GPS data recovered afterward showed was that he had lost contact with the fixed rope line somewhere in the whiteout and drifted. Not dramatically at first, a few feet off route, then more, the disorientation compounding with every step in zero visibility. He moved approximately 600 feet off the established line onto the exposed western face of the Geneva Spur. At around 26,500 feet, the terrain dropped away beneath him and he fell into a crevasse. The fall depth was estimated at between 35 and 50 feet based on where he was found. He made it to the bottom alive. Fractures with both legs, probable spinal trauma, according to the recovery team. The crevasse walls cut the wind, and the temperature inside sat at around -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Every climber that season was required to carry an electronic tracking chip. One of the few new mandates that actually worked the way it was supposed to. His GPS. Beacon fired on impact, and base camp had his coordinates within minutes. Finding a viable path to reach him at that altitude took time, though, and the whiteout conditions slowed everything down further. His GPS device and tracking chip were both recovered, giving investigators a full map of his route deviation from the moment he lost the fixed line to the point of the fall. The permit reseller was investigated afterward and found to have issued 14 permits that season without verifying a single applicant's experience. The official cause of death was hypothermia and exposure following traumatic injury, with the fractures and probable spinal trauma listed as contributing factors. The case was ruled accidental. The reseller was flagged for regulatory review ahead of the 2027 rule changes.